Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of love, resilience, and redemption. Today's story takes us on an emotional journey with Jimmy, a 12-year-old boy surviving the harsh streets of Chicago, when a chance encounter with a wealthy stranger leads to the discovery of a long-lost connection. Jimmy's life changes forever. This is a story of broken pasts, second chances, and the healing power of family. Stay tuned to witness how one moment can spark a transformation that redefines the meaning of home. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories to follow today's inspiring journey. The biting chill of a Chicago winter clung to the air, slicing through the thin fabric of Jimmy's tattered coat as he shuffled behind the bustling back alleys of South Side. At just 12 years old, Jimmy's life was a far cry from the carefree days most children his age enjoyed. His fingers, reddened and raw from the relentless cold, sifted through the piles of discarded trash behind a small Italian deli. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, a cruel companion that never seemed to leave, pushing him to continue his search. He'd been out here for hours, rummaging through soggy cardboard boxes and crumpled wrappers, hoping for anything to eat. Finally, tucked beneath a greasy pizza box, he found it, a slice of pizza, mostly intact. For a moment, he just stared at it, almost in disbelief. It was a treasure in his world, a feast compared to the scraps he was used to finding. Clutching the box like a prized possession, Jimmy hurried back to the only place he could call home, an abandoned, crumbling apartment building just a few streets away. The building loomed in the fading light like a ghostly monument to neglect. Windows were boarded up with uneven planks, while graffiti sprawled across the walls in vibrant chaos. A stark contrast to the grey skies above, Jimmy slipped through a broken fence, ducking under a weathered sign that read condemned in bold red letters. Inside, the air was cold and stale, heavy with the scent of damp and decay. But Jimmy knew every corner of the place, every weak floorboard to avoid, every nook that offered even the slightest bit of shelter. His room was on the second floor, a forgotten office space with 3 walls that still stood and a patch of ceiling that didn't leak too much when it rained. It wasn't much, but it was a fragile oasis amidst the chaos of the streets. Jimmy spread out his worn blanket and sat cross-legged on the makeshift bed of flattened cardboard boxes. He opened the pizza box carefully, savoring the smell of the grease and cheese. The first bite was warm, the flavors a rare comfort that made him close his eyes and imagine, just for a moment, that life wasn't so hard. As he ate, his gaze fell on the only possession that truly mattered to him, a small, cracked picture frame resting against the wall. The photograph inside was old and faded, but he didn't need clarity to remember the face smiling back at him. His mother, Grace. Her kind eyes and warm smile frozen forever in time. He reached for the frame, his fingers brushing lightly over the glass. The photograph was a lifeline to a time before everything had gone so wrong. A time when love filled the tiny apartment they'd once called home. Grace had been everything to Jimmy. She was a single mother, barely more than a teenager when she had him. But she worked tirelessly to give him a life full of warmth and love. Jimmy's earliest memories were of her soft voice reading him bedtime stories, her arms wrapping around him in a hug after a long day, and the scent of her perfume. Cheap but comforting. She had been his whole world. But life had a way of testing even the strongest people. When Jimmy was 6, Grace fell ill. At first, she brushed it off, calling it fatigue or a stubborn flu. But as the weeks turned into months, the truth became undeniable. The diagnosis was devastating, aggressive cancer that had already spread. For 2 years, Grace fought harder than Jimmy had ever seen anyone fight, pushing through pain and exhaustion, determined to stay with him. But no amount of determination could beat the disease. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Jimmy held her hand as she whispered her final words, "I love you, sweetheart. Always." After her death, Jimmy's world crumbled. With no family to take him in, he became a ward of the state, Thrown into the cold, impersonal foster care system, he bounced from one house to the next, never staying long enough to form a connection. Some foster parents were indifferent, treating him as just another responsibility. Others were cruel, taking their frustrations out on the quiet, grieving boy. In one particularly terrible home, Jimmy endured months of verbal and physical abuse before he finally gathered the courage to run away. That first night on the streets was terrifying. Jimmy huddled in a dark alley, jumping at every sound, certain that every shadow held danger. But as the days turned to weeks, he learned to navigate the brutal realities of his new life. He fell in with a group of other homeless kids who showed him the ropes, where to find food, which shelters were safe, and how to avoid trouble. It wasn't a life he would have chosen, but it was the one he had, and he was determined to survive. Despite everything, Jimmy never forgot who he was. He held onto the picture of his mother as if it were a piece of her, her spirit guiding him through the hardest moments. On the worst days, when hunger clawed at him and the cold seeped into his bones, he would pull out the photograph and talk to it. "I miss you, Mom," he would whisper, imagining her voice telling him to keep going, to stay strong. That evening, as the weak winter sunlight faded from the sky, Jimmy finished the last of his pizza and carefully placed the photo back into his bag. The world was unkind and unforgiving, but he carried his mother's love with him, a small flame that refused to go out. What he didn't know was that tomorrow would bring a chance encounter, one that would change his life forever. Morning came with a clear, cold sky, the kind of winter day that could be beautiful if you had the privilege of viewing it from somewhere warm. For Jimmy, the chill bit at his fingers and toes as he stirred awake on his makeshift bed. The abandoned building's crumbling walls did little to shield him from the elements. He washed his face with the last of the bottled water he had, slipped on his threadbare coat, and tucked his precious photo of Grace into the inside pocket near his heart. Every morning began the same way, a ritual of survival, preparing for another day of scavenging and staying invisible. Today, however, was different. As Jimmy walked through the bustling streets of Chicago, the rhythm of the city washed over him, the clatter of early morning deliveries, the sharp chatter of commuters clutching their steaming cups of coffee, the hum of life going on. Oblivious to the boy weaving through the crowd, he made his way to his usual spot, an alley near a bakery owned by Mr. Romano, a kind-hearted man who often left bags of stale bread and pastries for the homeless kids in the area. But as Jimmy rounded the corner, his heart sank. A police car was parked in front of the bakery, its silent lights flashing. Through the window, Jimmy saw Mr. Romano talking to two officers. Gesturing animatedly, Jimmy froze. Had someone reported him? Or worse, had Mr. Romano gotten into trouble for helping people like him? Not wanting to risk it, Jimmy turned and headed downtown, his stomach aching with hunger and worry. The streets grew busier as he neared the business district. Men and women in tailored suits hurried past him, their heels clicking against the pavement. To most of them, Jimmy was invisible, just another street kid who blended into the background. But Jimmy had learned to use this to his advantage. He found a corner near the subway entrance, where the constant flow of people often left behind dropped coins or discarded food. As he settled in, his attention was drawn to a sleek black town car pulling up to the curb. The door opened, and a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out, barking orders into his phone. "I don't care if they've flown in from Tokyo, the meeting is at 3, the man snapped before adjusting his tie against the wind. Jimmy's eyes tracked the man automatically, noting the tailored suit, polished shoes, and air of authority. This man, Jimmy thought, had never gone hungry a day in his life. But then, something unexpected happened. As the man reached to steady his tie, his grip on his phone faltered, and it slipped from his hand, clattering to the ground. In the same motion, a leather wallet fell from his coat pocket, landing just a few feet away. The man bent to pick up his phone, oblivious to the wallet lying on the cold sidewalk. Jimmy froze. Every instinct he had honed on the streets screamed at him to grab the wallet and run. It could mean food for weeks. Maybe even a new coat to replace the one barely holding together on his back. His stomach growled in agreement. But just as he began to move, another thought stopped him, his mother's voice. Clear and steady in his memory, honesty. Jimmy. It's all we really have in this world. Before he could second-guess himself, Jimmy darted forward, snatched the wallet, and called out, "Sir, you dropped this." The man turned, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Jimmy's dirt-streaked face. For a moment, he just stared, as if unsure what to make of the boy holding out his wallet. Then, slowly, he reached for it. "You're returning this?" the man asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes, sir," Jimmy said, his voice firm despite the nerves knotting his stomach. "It fell out of your pocket when you dropped your phone." The man's expression shifted, the hardness in his features softening ever so slightly. "What's your name, son?" he asked. "Jimmy. Jimmy Carter," the boy replied. The man seemed startled, as if the name carried some weight he wasn't prepared for. "Jimmy Carter," he repeated, almost to himself. After a pause, he said, "You've done me a great service today. This wallet holds some very important documents." Before Jimmy could respond, the man pulled out a crisp $100 bill and extended it to him. Jimmy's hand trembled as he took it, unused to holding so much money at once. "Thank you, Jimmy," the man said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've reminded me there's still good in the world." As the man strode away toward an imposing office building, Jimmy stood frozen, clutching the bill. But just as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. On the ground where the man had been standing was a small, crumpled photograph. When Jimmy picked it up, his heart nearly stopped. It was a picture of his mother, Grace, younger and smiling, her arm wrapped around a man Jimmy didn't recognize. Questions flooded his mind as he stared at the photo, his pulse racing. Why did this wealthy stranger have a photograph of his mother? What could it mean? As he looked up at the gleaming office building, a knot of fear and determination formed in his chest. Somewhere inside was the man who might hold the answers Jimmy didn't even know he was searching for. And he wasn't about to walk away. Jimmy stood at the base of the towering office building, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and determination. The photograph in his hand was unmistakable, his mother, Grace, younger and full of life, standing arm in arm with a man he had never seen before. He clenched the picture tightly, his breath fogging the cold air. Why did this stranger, the well-dressed man who had just walked inside, have a picture of his mother? The thought gnawed at him, pulling him toward the building's imposing glass doors. With a deep breath, Jimmy pushed through the revolving doors and found himself standing on glossy marble floors that gleamed under the soft light. The lobby was a hive of activity, with sharply dressed professionals moving purposefully in every direction. Jimmy felt acutely out of place in his worn sneakers and frayed coat. As he approached the receptionist's desk, his steps faltered under the weight of nervousness. The receptionist, a woman with a stern face and immaculate appearance, barely glanced at him before narrowing her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped and doubtful. "I need to speak with the man who just came in." Jimmy stammered. Mr. Marshall. I think. Grey hair. Expensive suit. He dropped this. And I need to give it back to him." He held up the photograph, careful not to let it leave his grasp. The receptionist hesitated. Her professional demeanor cracked for just a moment as she caught a glimpse of the photograph. "Wait here," she said sharply before picking up the phone. Jimmy stood awkwardly by the desk, feeling the weight of curious and disapproving glances from passing employees. After a tense exchange on the phone, the receptionist hung up and looked back at him. "Mr. Marshall will see you," she said. Her tone softened slightly. "Take the elevator to the top floor. His assistant will meet you there." Jimmy's heart pounded as he stepped into the elevator, watching the numbers climb higher and higher. When the doors slid open, he was greeted by a young woman in a crisp suit who ushered him down a quiet, carpeted hallway. At the end of the corridor, two large wooden doors loomed. The assistant knocked once and opened them, motioning for Jimmy to step inside. The office was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The man from earlier, Mr. Marshall, stood behind a massive mahogany desk, his piercing blue eyes fixed on Jimmy as he entered. "You found something else of mine?" Mr. Marshall asked, his tone calm but tinged with curiosity. Jimmy swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the photograph. "I found this outside after you left," he said, stepping forward and holding it out. It's my mom. Why do you have this picture?" Mr. Marshall took the photograph, his expression unreadable as he stared at it for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged with unspoken emotion. Finally, Mr. Marshall sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging as he sank into his chair. "The woman in this picture," he said quietly, "is Grace Carter, your mother." "And the man beside her," he paused, his voice thick with emotion. "That's me." Jimmy's mind reeled as he tried to process the revelation. "You knew my mom," he managed to choke out, his voice trembling. "Knew her?" Mr. Marshall's voice softened, his gaze distant. "Jimmy, I loved her. Grace was everything to me. But I was a fool, a coward. I let her go. And I've regretted it every single day since." Mr. Marshall began to tell his story. He and Grace had met when they were young. He a promising business student from a wealthy family. She a free-spirited woman determined to carve her own path. Their love had been passionate and undeniable. But it had also drawn the ire of Mr. Marshall's family. His father, a man of rigid expectations, had threatened to cut him off if he didn't end the relationship. "I was weak," Mr. Marshall admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I let my father's threats scare me. I broke things off with Grace. I told her I didn't love her anymore. But it was a lie. The biggest lie I ever told." Jimmy listened, his emotions swinging between anger and heartbreak. "And then what?" he asked, his voice sharp. "You just forgot about her? Forgot about me?" "No," Mr. Marshall said firmly, shaking his head. "I never forgot her. Not for a single day." Years later, when I finally had the courage to look for her, it was too late. She was gone. I didn't know about you, Jimmy. Not until after Grace had passed. Mr. Marshall's voice broke as he continued. "I've been searching for you ever since. All I had was your name, Thomas Carter, your grandfather's name, and a photo Grace had kept of us. But I couldn't find you. Not in the foster system. Not anywhere. And then today, I saw you. And I knew." Jimmy felt his chest tighten, his breath shallow as he grappled with the weight of the truth. The man sitting before him, this wealthy stranger, wasn't just someone who knew his mother. He was his father. And suddenly, Jimmy's world felt like it was spinning out of control. Jimmy sat frozen in the chair, the weight of Mr. Marshall's words pressing down on him like a physical force. His father. The man sitting across from him, the same man who had left Grace behind, was his father. A mix of emotions churned within him: anger, confusion, sorrow, and a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" Jimmy's voice was quiet but sharp, each word laced with pain. "If you loved her so much, why did you let her go? Why did you leave her to raise me alone?" Mr. Marshall's shoulders slumped. And for the first time, Jimmy saw something in him he hadn't expected: vulnerability. The powerful businessman who had barked orders on the street just hours ago now looked old and broken, his blue eyes filled with regret. "I can't undo what I did, Jimmy," he said softly, his voice heavy with emotion. "I made choices I'll regret for the rest of my life. I let fear and pride rule me. When I finally tried to fix my mistakes, it was too late. Your mother was gone. And I had lost her forever. But finding you, I thought maybe it was a chance to make things right. At least in some way. Jimmy's chest tightened, his emotions battling inside him. He thought of his mother, her warmth and love, the way she had always been there for him no matter how hard life became. And then he thought of the years of struggle and loss after her death, the endless foster homes, the nights spent cold and alone, the hunger that gnawed at him daily. Those years had shaped him, hardened him, and there was a part of him that wanted to shout at Mr. Marshall, to make him feel the pain he had lived through. But another part of him, the part that still carried his mother's lessons deep within him, wanted to listen. Grace had always told him that anger wouldn't change the past and that forgiveness was the only way to move forward. He wasn't sure if he could forgive Mr. Marshall, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, he could start by hearing him out. So what now? Jimmy asked, his voice quieter this time. What do you want from me? Mr. Marshall leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. I want to help you, Jimmy. I want to be the father I should have been all along. I know I can't erase the pain I've caused, but if you'll let me, I want to give you a chance at the life you deserve. Jimmy stared at him, the words swirling in his mind. A part of him wanted to scoff at the idea that money or comfort could erase years of struggle. But another part of him, a part that dared to hope, wondered if this could be real. Could this man, a stranger who had caused so much hurt, truly be the father he had longed for in his darkest moments? Finally, Jimmy nodded, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. I don't know if I can forgive you, he admitted. But I'm willing to try. If you're serious about this, we'll see where it goes. But don't think this is going to be easy. A wave of relief washed over Mr. Marshall's face. And for the first time, he allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. That's all I could ever ask for, he said. Thank you, Jimmy. In the days that followed, Jimmy's life shifted in ways he never imagined. Mr. Marshall insisted that Jimmy move in with him. And though Jimmy was reluctant, he couldn't deny the opportunity for warmth, food, and safety. The transition from the streets to a luxurious penthouse was overwhelming. The first night in his new room, Jimmy couldn't bring himself to sleep on the soft bed, opting instead to curl up on the floor in a corner, a habit born from years of needing to protect himself while he slept. Mr. Marshall, or Richard as he asked Jimmy to call him, tried his best to make Jimmy feel at home. He arranged for doctors to check on Jimmy's health, addressed long-neglected issues, and hired a tutor to help him catch up on his education. Richard was patient, but he also struggled with the vast distance between them. He wanted to connect with his son, but he quickly realized that Jimmy wasn't ready to simply accept him as a father. Their interactions were often strained, filled with moments of tension. Jimmy bristled at Richard's attempts to parent him, and Richard found himself walking a delicate line, trying not to push too hard. But amidst the challenges, there were small breakthroughs, moments when Jimmy allowed his guard to slip, when he would share a memory of his mother or laugh, albeit reluctantly, at one of Richard's awkward attempts at humor. For both of them, it was a fragile, tentative beginning. There were no guarantees, no promises that things would magically fall into place. But as they navigated the rocky terrain of their new relationship, one thing became clear: both father and son were willing to try. And in the quiet moments, when they let their defenses down, there was a glimmer of something they both desperately needed: hope. As the weeks passed, Jimmy's life became a whirlwind of adjustments, emotions, and challenges. The move into Richard's penthouse had been jarring. Everything about his new life felt foreign: the polished floors, the enormous windows that showcased the Chicago skyline, and the sheer silence of it all. It was so different from the bustling noise of the streets or the creaking, decaying walls of the abandoned buildings he once called home. Despite the warmth and safety of his new surroundings, Jimmy often felt out of place. The bed was too soft, the space too vast, and the meals far too rich for his liking. More than once, he found himself retreating to a corner of the room, curling up with a blanket, as he'd done during his years on the streets. Even though Richard had given him everything he could ever need, clothes, food, and access to education, Jimmy struggled to shake the habits and survival instincts that had kept him alive for so long. Richard, for his part, was determined to bridge the gap between them. He was careful not to overwhelm Jimmy, understanding that trust had to be earned and that years of absence couldn't be undone with gestures of generosity. Still, he made sure to be present, checking in with Jimmy daily, sharing meals, and listening, truly listening, whenever Jimmy chose to open up. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, the tension that often simmered between them came to a head. Richard was enthusiastically laying out plans for Jimmy's future, speaking of prestigious schools, internships, and opportunities that could set him on a path to success. To Richard, it was a way of making up for lost time, of giving Jimmy the life he'd always dreamed of providing. But to Jimmy, it felt suffocating. The memories of his mother's struggles, his own years of hardship, and the fierce independence he'd cultivated boiled over. "Just stop," Jimmy shouted, slamming his fork onto the table. "Stop trying to plan my whole life. You don't even know me. You don't know what I've been through." Richard froze, stunned by the outburst. "Jimmy, I'm just trying to help." "Help?" Jimmy cut him off, his voice shaking. "Where was all this help when Mom was working herself to death to keep a roof over our heads? Where were you when I was sleeping in alleys and digging through dumpsters for food?" The color drained from Richard's face. "Jimmy," he said softly, "I didn't know." "Don't call me that." Jimmy stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't get to just show up now and act like a dad. You don't get to pretend the last 12 years didn't happen." With that, Jimmy stormed out of the dining room, leaving Richard sitting alone at the table, his face etched with pain. Hours later, there was a gentle knock on Jimmy's bedroom door. He had been sitting on the floor, his back pressed against the wall, his mind racing with emotions. "What?" he called out, his voice hoarse. "Jimmy," Richard said quietly from the other side. "Can I come in, please?" After a long pause, Jimmy sighed and opened the door. Richard stood there, holding a battered showbox in his hands. His usually composed appearance was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed. "I think it's time I showed you something," he said. They sat together on the edge of the bed as Richard opened the showbox. Inside was a collection of letters, photographs, and small mementos, fragments of a life Richard had once shared with Grace. Richard's voice trembled as he began to speak. "After I left your mother, I tried to convince myself I'd done the right thing," he said. "But I couldn't stop thinking about her. I wrote her letters every week for a year, but I never sent them. I was too ashamed. Too afraid." Jimmy picked up one of the letters, its faded ink a testament to the years that had passed. "Why didn't you send them?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "I was a coward," Richard admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "By the time I worked up the courage to find her again, it was too late. She was gone. And then, I found out about you. I've spent years trying to find you. Jimmy, I know I can never make up for what I did, but I want to try." As the night wore on, they talked, really talked, for the first time. Jimmy shared stories of his mother, the good times and the struggles, while Richard listened, his heart breaking with every revelation. By dawn, something had shifted between them. The air was still heavy with pain, but it was laced with a newfound understanding. "I can't promise I'll forgive you," Jimmy said as the first rays of sunlight spilled into the room. "But I think I'd like to try. That's all I could ask for," Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. For the first time, he reached out and placed a hand on Jimmy's shoulder, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was a beginning, fragile, tentative, and filled with hope. Over the months, Jimmy and Richard worked to build a bond that neither had ever thought possible. It wasn't easy, Jimmy struggled to trust. And Richard had to prove his commitment every single day. But through shared moments, heartfelt conversations, and a growing understanding of each other, they began to heal the wounds of the past. Jimmy excelled in school, his resilience shining brighter than ever. Together, they created a scholarship in Grace's name, helping single parents pursue their dreams. The photograph of Grace and Richard, once a painful reminder of lost time, now sat framed on the mantel, a symbol of love and redemption. Their journey wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, a story of forgiveness, resilience, and the enduring power of family. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories for more heartfelt videos like this one.